Water drops from glaciers in the far north and gathers itself into a single moving line that cuts the length of Pakistan before spreading into the Arabian Sea, and everything the country is today sits somewhere along that line. Karachi crowds its port with container ships and traffic. Lahore keeps the domes and gardens of a much older empire pressed against modern traffic circles. Islamabad rises in careful government geometry. Punjab spreads in irrigated green squares, and to the west, the Balochistan Plateau climbs into dry brown ridges. A nuclear-armed state with megacities and motorways now controls this river. But if the highways and the border posts are stripped away and the concrete is peeled back from the ground beneath these cities, something older remains. Because there was no Pakistan for most of the time people have lived here. There was no India as it exists now. There was, for a long stretch, no Islam in this region at all. And several of history's most celebrated empires had not yet been imagined. Long before any of that, brick streets ran at right angles to each other in cities on this river, planned with a precision that predates Rome. Soldiers would one day cross mountain passes to the northwest in armies. Fortresses would rise at Lahore with gardens and mosques attached. British locomotives would eventually cut straight through Punjab's fields. Trains packed with refugees would cross a brand new border in 1947. Soldiers would lay down their weapons in Dhaka in 1971. A mountain at Chagai would shudder from an underground test in 1998. Out of a land absorbed again and again by larger empires, how did this particular country emerge? And why did gaining a state of its own not end its struggle, but launch decades of war, coup, and reinvention, including the loss of more than half its original population within a single generation? To understand any of that, the story cannot begin with a border drawn in 1947. It has to begin with the river itself, and with the people who settled beside it, long before anyone called this place a nation. Around 7,000 years before the Common Era, farming communities took hold along the corridors, linking the Iranian plateau to the Indus Basin, at sites such as Mehrgarh in Balochistan, where grain stores and penned livestock allowed families to remain in one place instead of following herds across the land. That stability produced surplus, and surplus produced something new. By the third millennium, before the Common Era, settlements at Harappa and at Mohenjo-daro had grown into full cities. With grid-patterned streets, covered drains running beneath brick houses, and a great public bath at their center, evidence of organized irrigation, specialized trade, and civic planning that placed this river valley among the earliest urban civilizations on Earth. That urban system began contracting after roughly 1900 years before the Common Era. Historians still debate the causes, pointing to shifting rivers, changing trade patterns, and environmental pressure rather than any single catastrophe. And the population did not vanish so much as disperse into different settlement patterns across the same landscape. What the river valley kept, long after its great cities shrank, was its position as a corridor. Persian administrators extended their influence into the region. Alexander's forces marched through the northwest. Mauryan rule and Buddhist trade networks followed, and at Gandhara and Taxila, Greek and South Asian artistic traditions blended into something distinct. Merchants, monks, and soldiers all used the same mountain routes, because the geography that had given this land its wealth had also stripped away its isolation. It would remain a crossroads that every rising power wanted to hold, and in the early 8th century, a new conquest arriving from the sea would begin the slow process of turning that crossroads into something religiously distinct. In 711 and 712, Umayyad forces under Muhammad ibn Qasim conquered much of Sindh, establishing Muslim rule along the lower Indus, though this was the beginning of a religious transformation rather than its completion. Since the surrounding society remained overwhelmingly Hindu, Buddhist, and locally diverse for generations afterward. Over the following centuries, dynasties based in Afghanistan and Central Asia pushed into Punjab through the same mountain corridors that had always connected the region outward, drawing Lahore and other urban centers into a Persian-influenced Islamic political culture. What deepened this transformation was not conquest alone, but settlement. Sufi teachers established shrines that drew farmers, artisans, and travelers into shared devotional life, and merchants and migrants carried the faith into everyday commerce and neighborhood life, far more effectively than any army could. By the time the Mughal Empire absorbed most of this territory from the 16th century onward, Islam was no longer simply the religion of a ruling elite passing through. Lahore became one of the empire's great cities, its forts, gardens, and mosques built to project imperial permanence, and its position along the routes linking Kabul, Delhi, and the Indus Basin made it a hinge for trade and taxation across the whole empire. A trader could move from Kabul through Lahore toward Delhi within a single unified system, and a farmer working irrigated Punjab fields operated inside an imperial economy that reached far beyond his own village. Military victory had opened the door centuries earlier, but it was generations of trade, migration, and religious institution building that made this land genuinely and durably Muslim in character. Mughal patronage made Punjab wealthy and central to imperial life, and that very wealth, once the empire's authority began to weaken, would make the region into a prize that new and rival powers were eager to seize. After the death of Aurangzeb, Mughal authority unraveled, and Delhi's control over Punjab and Sindh became increasingly nominal, even as garrisons and banners still stood in its name. Into that vacuum rose Sikh power in Punjab, eventually consolidated in the early 19th century under Ranjit Singh into a strong regional empire that made Lahore once again a capital city, rather than a distant provincial outpost. But a different and far larger power was expanding from the east. The British East India Company annexed Sindh in 1843, and after a series of wars against the Sikh state, annexed Punjab in 1849, bringing nearly all of what is now Pakistan under a single colonial administrative system for the first time. What followed mattered more than the conquest itself. Railways cut straight lines across the plains. Vast irrigation canals turned dry scrubland into some of the most productive agricultural territory in the empire, and new canal colonies rose around them. Karachi grew from a modest harbour into a major port crowded with steamships, carrying cotton and grain outward and manufactured goods back in. A farmer who had once worked marginal land now tended irrigated fields, feeding distant markets, while a merchant in Karachi watched rail wagons deliver the produce of a vast interior directly to the harbour. At the same time, following the uprising of 1857, the colonial army recruited heavily from Punjab and the frontier districts, and young men left their villages for military service and returned with pay, pensions, and a military culture that would remain embedded in the region's political economy for generations to come. Colonial administration also began sorting the population more explicitly than before, through census categories, education policy, and limited representative politics that increasingly organized Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and other communities as competing blocs rather than simply neighbors. Railways and canals had physically unified this land more tightly than any previous ruler had managed. But that same modernization turned jobs, political representation, and communal identity into things people now had to compete for, and religion, once simply a matter of private faith, was becoming a category of mass politics. As the 20th century opened, the pressing question facing British India was no longer who governed from London. It was who would govern once London eventually left. Muslim political elites, watching an electoral future take shape, worried that in a single unified democracy dominated by numbers, their community could become a permanent minority at the center of power. And in 1906, they founded the All India Muslim League to secure representation and protections within the colonial constitutional system. For decades afterward, the League, the Indian National Congress, and the British government argued over federation, elections, provincial autonomy, and minority safeguards. An argument that grew sharper as British withdrawal became conceivable rather than distant. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, once an advocate of Hindu-Muslim constitutional cooperation, gradually became the League's defining voice, though his rise reflected the collapse of a shared political vision rather than any single inevitable plan. In 1940, the Lahore Resolution called for Muslim-majority regions to be reorganized into political units with strong autonomy, a demand whose precise intentions historians still debate, but one that visibly moved the idea of a separate homeland from an intellectual possibility toward a mass political objective. The Second World War weakened Britain's capacity and appetite to hold on to its empire, and the post-war elections and negotiations that followed failed to produce any constitutional settlement acceptable to both Congress and the League, whose visions of a shared future had grown too far apart to reconcile. Partition increasingly looked to exhausted and divided leaders like the only workable resolution, despite the enormous risks it carried. When Britain finally withdrew in August of 1947, British India split into India and a new state called Pakistan, itself divided into a western wing, and, more than 1,000 miles away, across Indian territory, an eastern wing carved from Bengal. The boundary lines were drawn hurriedly and under enormous political pressure, based loosely on Muslim-majority districts, and the new state was born almost simultaneously with one of the deadliest mass migrations of the 20th century. Railway platforms filled with families fleeing in both directions, Muslims moving toward the new Pakistan, and Hindus and Sikhs moving out of the territories that had just become it. In scenes of displacement and communal violence, recorded across historical accounts on both sides of the new border. Colonial politics had turned religious identity into political arithmetic, but no constitutional formula had proven capable of satisfying both the League and Congress at once, and partition became the exit from that impasse, even as the new border immediately created fresh crises over migration, over the disputed territory of Kashmir, and over the basic capacity of a brand new state to govern itself. Pakistan now existed on a map. It still had to build a government, absorb millions of refugees, defend contested borders, and somehow rule two wings of territory separated by the length of a hostile neighbor. And these challenges arrived almost immediately. The new state's first years were consumed by emergency demands, as refugees poured in by the millions and disputes over the former princely states, above all Kashmir, hardened into open conflict with India, pushing security to the very center of national priorities before the country's institutions had time to settle. Jinnah himself died in 1948, barely a year after independence, leaving Pakistan without its founding leader, just as it began the harder work of building durable institutions. A deeper contradiction ran beneath these early crises. Leaders in the Western Wing promoted Urdu as the national language meant to unify the country, but the majority of Pakistan's population lived in the eastern wing and spoke Bengali. And the resulting Bengali language movement became a rallying symbol for a broader demand that East Pakistan's culture and political weight be genuinely recognized rather than absorbed. Constitutional progress moved slowly. A first constitution was not adopted until 1956, and it survived barely 2 years before being abrogated when martial law was declared in 1958, and General Ayub Khan emerged as military ruler. A shift produced by weak party structures and repeated political crisis, and one that placed the army directly inside the machinery of the state, rather than merely behind it. The Ayub years brought real industrial and infrastructural growth, but that growth deepened rather than eased the perception of inequality between the wealthier West and the more populous East. And a war with India in 1965, while it stirred national feeling, resolved none of the underlying legitimacy problems at home. Ayub left power in 1969, succeeded by General Yahya Khan, and the following year, Pakistan held a general election whose results proved impossible to absorb peacefully. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won an outright national majority, built almost entirely on an overwhelming victory in East Pakistan, giving it, by the ordinary logic of a parliamentary system, the clear right to form the next government. That transfer of power never took place. Negotiations collapsed, and on the 25th of March, the Pakistani military launched a violent crackdown in East Pakistan, known as Operation Searchlight. Pakistani forces and allied militias carried out widespread atrocities against civilians, a period historical records describe as marked by mass killing and mass displacement, even as exact casualty figures remain sharply disputed among historians to this day. There was also violence committed against non-Bengali civilians by some Bengali forces, though this did not diminish responsibility for the scale of the military crackdown itself. Millions fled across the border into India as the crisis widened from a political standoff into a full civil war, and in December, India entered the conflict directly. Pakistani forces in the east surrendered before the end of the month, and East Pakistan became the independent nation of Bangladesh, a country created in part on the argument that Muslims required a unified political homeland had just failed to hold its own two Muslim majority wings together, proving that shared religion alone could never fully dissolve the differences of language, economy, and regional power that ran beneath it. Out of that trauma, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto emerged as Pakistan's central civilian leader, presiding over a state that had just lost the majority of its population and much of its military prestige in a single year. His government produced the 1973 Constitution, establishing a parliamentary federal framework that has remained the country's basic legal foundation ever since, an attempt to build the durable, institutional settlement between centre and provinces that earlier constitutions had failed to secure. Bhutto also nationalized major parts of the economy and pursued an increasingly serious nuclear program, driven by a desire to rebuild sovereignty and strategic parity with India after the humiliation of 1971. But disputed elections in 1977 triggered mass protests, and Army Chief General Zia-ul-Haq seized power in a coup, after which Bhutto was executed following a deeply controversial judicial process. Zia's regime went further than Ayub's had, embedding Islamic law and religious institutions more deeply into the machinery of the state, seeking legitimacy outside the ballot box by tying national identity ever more closely to Islam. Then, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Pakistan's frontier position once again reshaped its fate. The country became a frontline state in the Cold War, as the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan channeled weapons and funding to Afghan resistance networks. Millions of Afghan refugees crossed into Pakistani territory, and Peshawar transformed into a crowded hub of exile politics, foreign intelligence, and armed movements. Pakistan's military and intelligence institutions gained enormous resources and strategic importance from this arrangement. But the militant infrastructure built during the Afghan Jihad would leave consequences that outlasted the war itself by decades. Zia died in a plane crash in 1988, and elections returned, appearing to promise a genuine return to civilian rule, even though the deeper question of who truly controlled Pakistan had not been settled, only postponed, and a parallel project begun after 1971, the country's nuclear deterrent, was nearing completion at the very same moment. Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif alternated in power through the 1990s, their governments repeatedly dismissed, amid corruption accusations and institutional conflict. Proof that democracy had returned without yet achieving settled civilian supremacy over the military and presidency. That fragile balance was overtaken by events in May of 1998, when India tested nuclear devices and Pakistan responded within weeks, with its own underground tests at Chagai, transforming South Asian security permanently and giving Pakistan the deterrent its leaders had sought since the loss of the East, even though nuclear weapons, as events soon proved, could not eliminate conventional conflict. A limited but dangerous conflict in Kargil in 1999 sharpened tensions between Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and Army Chief Pervez Musharraf, culminating in another military coup, placing the country under direct military rule for the first time in more than 40 years. The attacks of September the 11th, 2001, then transformed the country's strategic position overnight. As the United States invaded Afghanistan, Musharraf aligned Pakistan with the American-led war on terror, a choice made almost unavoidable by the country's border, its intelligence networks, and its prior relationships with the Afghan Taliban. Billions of dollars in foreign support followed, but so did a spreading militancy that increasingly struck inside Pakistan's own cities and frontier regions. A bitter irony in which the very frontier that had made Pakistan valuable during the war against the Soviets now made it vulnerable in a new war against militant networks it had once helped arm. Opposition to Musharraf grew through a lawyers' movement and broader political mobilization. And when Benazir Bhutto returned from exile, she was assassinated in 2007. A killing that became a stark symbol of how political violence and democratic fragility had become intertwined. Musharraf resigned the following year, and civilian government returned, once more, though this time something genuinely new began. Elected governments started completing full terms and transferring power without another immediate coup, even as the deeper struggle over who truly controlled Pakistan simply changed its shape, rather than disappearing. That struggle continued into the following 2 decades, now expressed through constitutional reform, economic strategy, and renewed confrontation, rather than direct military takeover. In 2010, the 18th Amendment reduced presidential power and expanded provincial autonomy, rebalancing the 1973 Constitution toward federalism, a direct answer to the very lesson East Pakistan had once paid for with its separation, that provincial power could not simply be dictated from the center. From the middle of the 2010s, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor became a major development framework, with new roads, power infrastructure, and the port at Gwadar symbolizing closer economic ties with Beijing, even as later analysis pointed to both genuine trade opportunities and real structural limits in the arrangement. Imran Khan rose to power in 2018 and was removed through a parliamentary no-confidence vote in 2022, after which relations between Khan, his supporters, state institutions, and the military establishment deteriorated into a mass political confrontation rather than a narrow elite dispute. The 2024 elections produced a fragmented result and a coalition government under Shehbaz Sharif, while Khan's supporters continued to challenge the process, and observers widely described the armed forces as still the country's most powerful institution after decades of shaping political outcomes from behind and, increasingly, in front of the scenes. In 2025, constitutional changes expanded the army chief's formal command authority and restructured constitutional adjudication. Changes supporters defended in institutional terms and critics described as weakening democratic checks. While that same year brought another dangerous military confrontation between Pakistan and India in May, underscoring that nuclear deterrence had reduced but never eliminated the risk of escalation between the two rivals. Meanwhile, IMF-backed economic stabilization remained a central and unresolved concern heading into 2026, as ordinary households continued to feel politics not through constitutional argument, but through inflation, electricity prices, and the daily search for stable work. The Indus still runs the same course it always has, past Mohenjo-daro's buried streets, past Taxila's Buddhist ruins, through Lahore, where Mughal domes still rise beside modern traffic, alongside the railways and canals the British built, through neighborhoods that still carry the memory of partition, beneath a constitution written in 1973, past a military that remains one of the state's most powerful institutions, and toward a nuclear order that began at Chagai in 1998. Pakistan became Pakistan because Muslims across British India came to believe they needed a homeland of their own. But that single explanation accounts only for the country's creation, not for everything geography, provincial diversity, war, military intervention, and nuclear rivalry made of it afterward. What defines this land? From the first farmers beside the Indus to the crowded cities standing on its banks today, has never been permanence. It has been adaptation under extraordinary pressure as borders shifted, capitals changed, rulers rose and fell, and even the territory of the country itself was cut in half, while the same underlying challenge endured beneath every version of it: how to turn a strategic crossroads filled with different peoples, languages, and histories into a political community capable, still, of holding together.